After decades of enduring the horrors of slavery, black people finally regained their status as humans when slavery was abolished. However, this marked the beginning of another era characterized by brutality and systemic racism, aimed at keeping black people economically underprivileged and politically powerless. They were systematically marginalized and made second- and third-class citizen rights. Housing segregation was enforced, forcing black people to live in separate communities, segregated from white populations. Segregation permeated every aspect of life, resulting in segregated schools, swimming pools, restaurants, recreational areas, and even churches. White individuals and institutions believed that this segregation would eventually lead to the extinction of black people. However, the opposite occurred as the black community thrived and saw significant increases in land ownership and wealth. In response, racist individuals and institutions in the United States initiated sweeping efforts to strip black people of their land and wealth. Hence, generational wealth that black people had painstakingly accumulated was confiscated, leading to a stark wealth gap between black and white populations. But how was this accomplished so insidiously yet systematically? Let's know about this and learn about black history, which American history books exclude.
The Black History Archives.
In the early 20th century, African Americans owned the substantial 14 million acres of land. Tragically, this land was forcibly taken through a combination of tactics and structural racism. People were led to believe that this confiscation was not only legal but also necessary. However, it was essential only for white supremacists seeking to amass wealth and control over the lands of black individuals. As we entered the 21st century, a staggering 90% of the original 14 million acres had been unjustly taken from African Americans. Today, they hold a mere 1.1 million acres of farmland, with partial ownership of an additional 1.07 million acres. Throughout the century, white farmers and landowners employed various methods to dispossess African Americans of their land. As a result, black landowners consistently lost the wealth they had painstakingly accumulated over generations. Both laws and practices allowed white landowners, farmers, and developers to manipulate the system and gain control over land owned by African American farmers and homeowners. Following the Civil War, a significant number of black Americans became landowners when the government allocated roughly 20 million acres, primarily in the South, under the Homestead Act. These landholdings could have served as a foundation for the accumulation of black wealth in post-Jim Crow America. However, they instead enriched only white supremacists, exacerbating the racial wealth gap. This was due to a violent and brutal machinery white supremacists had designed to either eliminate black families holding land or scare them so they leave their lands. In Birmingham, Kentucky, during the early 20th century, the town had a predominantly black population and served as a center for tobacco production. Tragically, it became a target for violence and land seizures. One night in 1908, armed white individuals, known as night riders, terrorized the town, resulting in the deaths of several black residents. Property records revealed that 14 black landowners lost over 60 acres of farmland and 21 city lots to white individuals, often as sheriff's sales for paltry prices. In Pierce City, Missouri, another horrifying incident unfolded on August 18, 1901. 1,000 armed white individuals set fire to 5 houses owned by black residents and tragically killed 4 black individuals. In the aftermath of this brutal attack, all 129 black residents of the town made the painful decision to flee, never to return. Shockingly, it was reported by the Associated Press that 9 Pierce City black citizens lost a total of 30 acres of farmland and 10 city lots. These properties were later purchased by white individuals at deeply discounted prices. Evelyn Brinson, whose home was among those burned by the mob, eventually sold her lot for a mere $25 to a white woman after the harrowing attack. It is essential to note that black people were often coerced into giving away their lands to avoid lynching. They had to choose between their death and land. Lynchings and mob attacks targeting black individuals were frequently followed by mass evacuations of black citizens, many of whom were forced to abandon their properties or sell them at unfairly low prices. These black landowners found themselves under immense pressure, both from authorities and others, to vacate their land and leave, effectively becoming refugees in their own country. One such grim example is the disheartening story from 1920 in Ocoee, Florida. Following an Election Day attack on the black community, 18 black families were forced to flee, resulting in the loss of 330 acres of land and 48 city lots. Sometimes, individual black farmers faced targeted attacks by groups of white farmers known as the Whitecaps. These groups operated in several southern and border states around the turn of the 20th century to drive black landowners from their property and discourage other black individuals from acquiring land. The Whitecaps often attached notes with crudely drawn coffins to the doors of black landowners, issuing warnings to leave or face dire consequences. One such tragic incident involved Eli Hilson of Lincoln County, Mississippi. On November 18, 1903, he received a warning, but a month later, despite ignoring it, the 39-year-old farmer was fatally shot as he drove his buggy toward his farm. His lifeless body was found when his horse returned home, delivering the grim news to his wife Hannah. Left to raise their 11 children and manage the 74-acre farm without her husband, she eventually lost the property through mortgage foreclosure in 1905. Records indicate that the farm was sold for over $400 to S.B. Oliver, a county supervisor. Today, the property is worth tens of millions of dollars. However, it wasn't solely the actions of the Whitecaps and night riders that compelled black individuals to relinquish their land. Sometimes it was the actions of officials. In Yazoo County, Mississippi, Norman Stevens and his twin brother, Homer, operated a trucking business that transported cotton pickers to plantations. In 1950, a white farmer demanded immediate delivery of workers to this field, but Stevens had prior commitments and promised to drop off the laborers later. In response, the farmer summoned the sheriff, and that evening, the Stevens brothers found themselves locked in a second-floor room at the county jail. Fearing for their lives, they managed to escape through a window, leaping to the ground and fleeing. Rosie Fields, Stevens' wife, shared that her husband had overheard the sheriff discussing where to hide their bodies. Here's a reminder to please support us so we can make more videos for you by subscribing to our channel and giving the video a like. We want to build a strong community and we need your support. Let's continue now. Following this narrow escape, the Stevens brothers flagged down a bus heading to Ohio. A year later, Rosie Fields and her 5 children joined them. For a decade, the family diligently made mortgage and property tax payments on the house they had left behind, as documented in records. However, the financial strain became overwhelming, and they never dared to return. In the 1960s, they ceased making payments and ultimately lost the house they had purchased for $700 in 1942. When violence proved ineffective against black people, legal hurdles like taxation were created. Tax sales provided a means to take land from its rightful owners and put it up for auction. This was done when white tax assessors often inflated the assessed value of black-owned land, imposing an unfairly heavy tax burden on black property owners. Hence, black people living in the same town where whites lived paid taxes many times more than what white residents paid. This practice gradually eroded the income of the black families. In cases where black-owned property appreciated in value or when a black property owner challenged white supremacy, local authorities could simply declare the property tax delinquent and auction it off. In such situations, black property owners often preferred to retain their land rather than sell it. However, many of them have fixed incomes, making it increasingly challenging to cover their annual property taxes. Once they failed to pay, the county would place their property up for auction. Developers exploited this situation when they sought access to land that families were reluctant to sell. The story of Evelina Jenkins, a native of the South Carolina Sea Islands, serves as a poignant example. She owned numerous acres of land, including an entire island, during the early 1970s when property values along the state's coastline were skyrocketing. Unfortunately, due to the state's inadequate investment in schools for people of color, Miss Jenkins received minimal education and never learned to read. Decades of disfranchisement and white control over local government and the courts had instilled in her the belief that any rights and protections these institutions offered did not apply to her. Even entering local government offices, where people registered for licenses or paid their taxes, meant inviting mistreatment and humiliation, something she sought to avoid. Hence, Miss Jenkins entrusted a white neighbor who had befriended her with the task of delivering her annual property tax payments to town on her behalf. However, instead of submitting these payments, the neighbor pocketed them. He waited for Miss Jenkins' taxes to become delinquent, at which point he purchased the lien to her property at the county's annual tax auction. After the statutory redemption period had passed, he gained full ownership of her land holdings, including the island. In the decades that followed, the land once owned by Miss Jenkins generated substantial wealth. Houses on the island she had once owned now sell for well over $400,000. Tragically, Miss Jenkins never benefited from this prosperity. Rather than leaving her children with a substantial inheritance, she passed away penniless, compelled to spend her final days in her daughter's mobile home. While Miss Jenkins' case was exceptionally appealing, the legal appropriation of Black-owned land through similar means was not uncommon in thriving real estate markets like Hilton Head and the surrounding Sea Islands. Tax sales offered investors a lucrative opportunity to acquire valuable property at a fraction of its true value. Another method used to rob Black people of their land was the Torrens Act. This system was first developed in Australia in 1858 by Sir Robert Torrens. This system aimed to strengthen the certainty of land ownership and simplify land transactions. When introduced in the United States, the Torrens Act was intended to streamline the process of registering property titles. However, it created a loophole that allowed third parties to forcibly dispossess Black families of their property through partition sales. Partition sales came into play when one property owner desired to sell, but others did not agree. Under the Torrens Act and related regulations, these sales could occur without notifying other family members or co-owners of the land. Once the sale occurred, the rules associated with the Torrens Act protected the buyer from any legal challenges by owners who were either unaware of the sale or had not consented to it. Another method employed to exploit Black landowners was the Harris Property Act, typically referring to family-owned land that has been passed down through multiple generations without undergoing the formal legal procedures required to establish ownership conclusively. In the absence of proper legal proceedings upon an owner's death, heirs may possess the property, but they lack the clear legal title necessary to definitively prove ownership. This limitation meant they might find themselves unable to sell the property or use it as collateral for loans. It also exposed them to a higher risk of losing the property through a partition action or due to failure to pay property taxes. Over generations, the number of co-owners of Harris property often grew substantially. This posed challenges for landowners, particularly when not every family member could be located to seek permission to sell the land. Consequently, even if some family members wished to retain the land, others could choose to sell it. White developers frequently capitalized on family miscommunication to seize control of the land. These partition sales frequently resulted in the land being sold for a fraction of its actual market value, benefiting the buyer while leaving displaced family members with nothing. Speculators exploited this legal maneuver to compel the sale of millions of acres of Black-owned land over several decades. What if Black people possessed the wealth and land they once owned? Isn't it true that the Black population would be thriving in the U.S. today? Speak out and let us know your thoughts on the systemic robbing of Black people's wealth and land in the comments section right below. Would you like us to make more videos? If yes, please support us by subscribing to the Black History Archives and clicking the bell icon. You can check out more videos on our channel too.